Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to take a really fascinating deep dive into one of the oldest stories in human history, the story of King Nimrod of Babylon. But, we're not just dusting off a history book today. We are breaking down the very anatomy of ultimate power and how having absolutely everything can lead to a deeply, almost unbelievable, ironic downfall. It's a story that asks a profound question: what actually happens when a human being is given the world, but completely forgets the source of those gifts? Well, let's unpack the moral lessons hidden in the ruin of the world's first true tyrant.
Check out this quote from the source material. "The tyrant is not born of evil, he is born of a blessing that makes him forget." Think about that for a second. We usually picture historical villains as these monsters born straight out of the shadows, right? But the text offers a much more chilling perspective. Nimrod actually wasn't born a tyrant. He was born with immense blessings. He survived a mass execution of infants and eventually rose to unimaginable wealth and power. But here's the trap. Having too much can actually corrupt you. The sheer overwhelming weight of his blessings made him forget that he was just a human being who received them.
So let's jump right into Act 1, the seed of arrogance. At the very core of this downfall is a concept called al-ghurur. Now, this is a very specific, incredibly dangerous type of arrogance. The source describes it not just as having a big ego, it's way worse than that. It's a deep, echoing emptiness. Imagine having everything you could ever want, a massive kingdom, endless riches, but feeling this massive void inside that no amount of gold can possibly fill. Al-ghurur is the illusion of self-sufficiency. It's exactly what happens when you're given so much that you start to genuinely believe you created it all yourself. You completely forget the giver of the blessings. For Nimrod, this arrogance became like a cancer. He basically asked himself, why should I obey anyone when I own all of this? And honestly, that single arrogant thought was the beginning of the end for him. And that brings us to the illusion of total control. Picture this. Nimrod sat on a throne of solid gold, right in the heart of Babylon, a city with these massive walls and hanging gardens that literally seemed to defy nature. He looked out over lands that stretched as far as the eye could see. But because of that internal emptiness we just talked about, he still needed more. He needed to be seen as an actual god. So he erected massive statues of himself everywhere. He turned fear into a religion, because as it turns out, when a tyrant has enough power, silence becomes a form of worship, and fear becomes faith. He entirely believed his own myth of invincibility. He really thought he was completely untouchable. Which brings us to Act 2, the contrast of power. On one side of the ring, you have Nimrod. He's armed with the world's greatest armies, endless gold, but underneath it all, he is fundamentally driven by fear, ego, and a desperate need for control. On the other side, we have a young man named Abraham. Now, Abraham has absolutely no weapons, no army, he doesn't even have armor. But what he does have is a quiet, unshakable faith in the true Creator. When Abraham stands before Nimrod's golden throne, he looks at him not as a god, but just as a frightened man. And let me tell you, a tyrant can tolerate just about anything except the gaze of someone who simply isn't afraid of them. This encounter leads to the ultimate debate. Nimrod, in his arrogance, claims, "I am the one who gives life and causes death," and he tries to prove it by arbitrarily executing one prisoner and freeing another. It's a cheap, incredibly cruel trick. But Abraham, he doesn't even flinch. He just delivers this absolutely devastating logical blow. He says, "My Lord brings the sun from the east, so bring it from the west." Wow. Suddenly, the entire power dynamic shatters. The source actually notes that Nimrod was struck with this heavy, humiliating silence. The logic was like a knife straight to the heart of his falsehood. In front of his entire court, he realized he had absolutely zero control over the actual universe.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. When a tyrant is outsmarted and humiliated, they never reflect or apologize, right? They resort to brute force. Nimrod decides his only move is to burn Abraham in a massive, unsurvivable fire. We're talking a fire so huge that people could only watch it from a distance. But then the unthinkable happens. Abraham miraculously emerges from the flames completely unharmed, like he's just taking a stroll through a garden of roses. Nimrod watches this happen, and instead of having a wake-up call and realizing he's outmatched by a higher power, his arrogance just pushes him straight over the edge of sanity.
And that pushes us right into Act 3, the peak of hubris. Refusing to submit, Nimrod decides he is going to physically travel into the sky to fight Abraham's God. Yes, you heard that right, literally. He builds this massive wooden box. Then, he ties 4 starving eagles to the corners. He dangles pieces of meat on sticks just out of their reach above them, which forces the desperate birds to fly upward, carrying this box higher and higher. It is incredibly, almost laughably absurd.
He looks down, sees his mighty kingdom reduced to a tiny dot, and his ego just swells even further. He actually thinks the view from the top means he owns the top. So he draws his bow and he shoots an arrow into the empty sky. And then, through this bizarre twist of fate, the arrow strikes a bird mid-flight and falls back down to earth smeared with blood. Well, Nimrod sees exactly what his ego wants him to see. He lands and proudly declares a false victory to the masses. "I have killed the God of Abraham." And the crowds applaud, mostly out of fear and ignorance. But this bloody arrow, it's a completely hollow victory. It is the absolute peak of al-Ghurur, a delusion so incredibly deep that it completely blinds its owner to reality. He thinks he's conquered heaven, but in reality, he has just sealed his own doom.
Now here comes Act 4, the ironic downfall. Nimrod gathers the most terrifying, earth-shaking army the world has ever seen, just to prove his supremacy once and for all. We're talking uncountable horses, deafening noise, enough swords to literally block out the sun. And what is God sent to defeat the man who claimed to be the master of the universe? It's not a lightning bolt, it's not an earthquake, it's not a flood. He sends a swarm of mosquitoes. Weightless, silent, tiny insects. The mosquitoes descend upon this mighty army. The horses panic, the soldiers flee, and all those swords are entirely useless against a cloud of bugs. The greatest army on Earth is completely dismantled by creatures they can barely even see. But the story zeroes in on this one excruciating detail. One mosquito, just one out of the millions, was assigned a very specific target. It flies directly into King Nimrod's nose and travels right up into his head. This has to be the smallest assassin in human history. Think about it. The man who built giant monuments, who commanded endless troops, and who literally shot arrows at the heavens, is suddenly brought to his knees by an insect that doesn't even weigh a fraction of an ounce.
40. That is the number of days Nimrod suffered an unimaginable agony. The insect buzzing and moving around inside his head caused a pain that no sword had ever inflicted on him. For 40 straight days, the grand illusion of his divinity was completely, painfully stripped away. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't think, he certainly couldn't rule. He was reduced to just a fragile, broken man entirely at the mercy of a tiny, weightless creature. And here is the ultimate, profound humiliation. The pain in Nimrod's head was so unbearable that the only thing that gave him even a slight, temporary relief was physical trauma. He, the man who forced everyone to bow to him, the man who claimed to give life and death, ended up begging his own servants to beat him on the head with their shoes. Just picture that scene in your mind for a second. The absolute ruler of the earth, crying out in pain, having his head repeatedly struck with dirty sandals just to briefly distract him from the buzzing of a mosquito. It is the absolute perfect, poetic destruction of ego.
Finally, we arrive at Act 5, the moral extraction.
History leaves us with two entirely different blueprints here. Nimrod's empire turned to dust. Today, his story survives solely as a cautionary tale of unchecked arrogance, of exactly what happens when the human being receives the world but completely forgets to be grateful for it. Abraham, on the other hand, had no throne, he had no army, but his legacy was built on truth and humility. And today, thousands of years later, he is remembered worldwide with love, peace, and absolute reverence. The source reminds us that whatever is built on ego and ingratitude will ultimately collapse, no matter how shiny and powerful it looks on the outside. But what is built on truth, that endures.
So, I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought from our source material. What do you possess tonight that you are forgetting to be thankful for? Seriously, your health, your mind, the safety of your family sleeping nearby, these are incredible, massive blessings. Nimrod had more wealth than we could ever even imagine, but his total lack of gratitude is what destroyed him. True power isn't found in what you own. It's in recognizing exactly where your blessings come from and staying humble. Take a moment to reflect on your own blessings tonight. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.